Okay, welcome back, everybody. Let's get started. Recall last time we talked about network visualizations. First, we talked about some graph theory, right, and some graph terms. Then we talked about node link representations, and we had these kind of free layouts as one of the major classes where you could kind of position your nodes and your edges wherever you want. And we talked about some of the algorithms that we can use to create these layouts. Then we had style layouts and fixed layouts. And now we're moving on to the next class of network visualizations, which are these matrix representations. Okay, so what are matrix representations? Like, what we do is, instead of a node link diagram, we use an adjacency matrix. So here is the equivalent network on the left shown as a node link diagram, and on the right is a matrix representation, right? And so what we have is we have 5 nodes from A to E, and we can see that A, B, C, D, E are kind of like shown both as the columns and as the rows of this matrix. And then whenever we have an edge that connects a node to another node, that cell that corresponds to that intersection between those two nodes is filled in. So for example, we have A to B here, or we have A to C. This edge is here, right? And similarly, would have like B to A, B to C, and B to D. So what we can see is B to A, B to C, B to D, right? All of this is filled in. And so here are some properties of this adjacency matrix. One thing that we can immediately see is that this here is symmetrical, right? And so why is it symmetrical? Yeah. Exactly. And can you imagine a case where this wouldn't be symmetrical? Exactly. When we have a directed graph, then we have to specify are the rows from and the columns to, or the other way around, right? So that's just a convention that you have to come up with. But if you have an undirected graph, you can read it in both different ways. And here are just some examples of topology and what to look for if you want to look at a matrix. So if you have this star representation, you can quickly see, okay, these are all neighbors of X. And actually, adjacency matrices are really good at quickly spotting neighborhoods, right? So you can just check out what are all the neighbors of B. All you have to do is go over this row, and you see it's ACD. What are the neighbors of E? You know it's CD, right? So it's very easy to spot neighborhoods. Then here is these are directed graphs, so you have to read this a little bit more carefully. Then here we have more or less a click, but a directed click, and that would be kind of like this this pattern here. Then here we would have like a bipartite network that might be like slightly, or actually not a bipartite network, but a network that's laid out in 2 parts here. That would be like a slightly harder to read. And then here we have this kind of like tightly connected piece down here. Okay, so they are these matrices, as I said, they're well suited for neighborhood-related topology-based tasks. I can just like, for B, I can just check what are the neighbors, but they're not really great for paths, right? If you want to understand how are 2 nodes in this network here, like for example, how is A to B connected, that is kind of tricky to do. If they're not directly connected, it's hard, right? So you probably have to sit down with a pencil and look at and start tracing how these connections actually work. And we actually ran a study on this, and that study showed that people really, not surprisingly, suck at trying to do path tasks in matrices. So if you want to do anything about topology for more than like neighborhoods, then you should probably not use matrices. Here's just another example of how like a network can look like. You see some example of completely connected clicks, and some clusters and some biclicks here in these various patterns. And so the one thing that's really important about matrices, and this is like very similar to what we talked when we talked about heat maps, remember, is that the order is so important. So here we have these 2 different versions of the same adjacency matrix. And what you can see here is this is like our alphabetically sorted. This is again our Les Miserables network. And alphabetically sorted is essentially like meaningless, right? But if I sort it by clusters, it becomes extremely apparent that there is some structure in this network, right? So we have this cluster here, we have this cluster here, there's one cluster here, we have this cluster here, and we can also spot these big star patterns, right? And what do you think these stars correspond to? Exactly. It's a major character. It's a very central part of that network, right? So if you like look at highly connected nodes, you will see these star patterns, right? And so we have another one here. It's a little less evident, but this person here, Gavroche, is also like a little bit of a star pattern here. And then the person next to them here, Marius, we have a little bit of that too, right? So these are kind of like, you know, the nodes that connect between the clusters, but most of these other elements here are connected within the cluster. And then you can come up with all kinds of sorting, right? By name is like a bad sorting, as we said at the beginning, right? So that basically this looks like noise. But if we do by frequency, we might see a little bit more, but it's still not as good as by cluster, right? So here we can see some frequency, but that some clusters, but it's not as robust as if we do it by cluster. And so there are many different algorithms on how to calculate these clusters. There's actually a JavaScript library called reorder.js that implements many of those different algorithms. So you can take your pick. These are also called clustering algorithms or seriation algorithms, right? Like, because it's about how I order the matrix. So in summary, the pros of matrix representation is that they can represent all graph classes except for hypergraphs. So hypergraphs are tricky, right? Because we have this edge relationship between that kind of like this in one sweep connects all of the elements, and that's not possible in the matrix. It is kind of like focused on the edge sets. So like, you know, you gave a lot of space to the edges. And for example, if you have an edge weight, which we kind of had in this example actually here, if you look closely, those are the weight, like these are not all the same opacity, right? So they're weighted. And so if you have, for example, edge weights, this is a good way to visualize it. It is, of course, trivial to create a layout for this because you don't have to do anything like a force-directed layout for it, because you can just render this in rows and columns. Of course, you have to think about the seriation. It is well suited for attribute-based tasks on the edges, as I already mentioned, via coloring on the matrix cells, and it's well suited for neighborhood-related topology-based tasks, so like finding all the neighbors and the properties of the neighbors and so on. The con is they tend to get big, right? So even on a typical screen nowadays, if you want to still read a label, you can probably do like 150 or so. If you don't want to see a label, you can go down further, but generally, like, this is quadratic screen space, right, by the number of nodes. So like definitely not feasible with like a 3,000 node network. And they're of course not well suited for path-related topology-based tasks. And so, you know, there have been some attempts to kind of like combine the pros and the cons of these layouts. Like, one observation is that if you have dense clicks in the networks that are sometimes connected, it might be cool to do a hybrid approach like this. So here, this would be like a collaboration graph. And so you would assume that researchers within a particular organization often collaborate with each other, but also occasionally collaborate with somebody outside, right? And so this is kind of what this shows. This is like the close collaborators are in one matrix, and then there are these connection lines to people that are connected, but are not in the same cluster, right? So that's kind of a cool idea. Although, like, what's the downside of a layout like this? Like, what would happen if you print this in the newspaper? Do you think your readers would get it? No. So that's really an expert tool, right? And even then, like, this is like a cool idea, but really hasn't made like a big splash in practice. So like one approach that to deal a little bit with the quadratic screen space is to do a hierarchization of the representation. So if you have clusters, you could just, like, instead of representing each node in a cluster, you could again take the supernode idea, right? That you roll up all of the nodes of a cluster into one supernode. And so that's kind of like what we do here. In this particular example, this is kind of rolled up in these different things. And now I could, instead of like representing the matrix like this, I could show the matrix like this. So I can say there's like 5 connections within here, right? And then there's 1 connections from this cluster to this cluster. and there's one connection from this cluster to this cluster, and so on, right? So that would be kind of like a way to deal with scale for matrices. And then this is some work we did a couple of years ago together with neuroscientists, and they were kind of like studying connectivity patterns in the brain. And maybe I'll play the video here to show what's going on here, but just as a teaser, this is about multi-hop connections, right? So think about if you want to fly someplace. Well, like if you are in Salt Lake City, that's great because we have a lot of direct connections, but if still most airports in the world can't be reached directly, right? But you still can reach them. And so if you want to ask questions like as how long does it take me to reach a particular airport, you could think of higher order connectivity, like how many hops away is something. And so this is this idea of this paper.
Graphs model relationships between entities, such as flights between
In this video, we introduce two novel visualization techniques that provide an overview of graph activity. They are the connectivity matrix and the intermediate node table. We present these two techniques and a prototype implementation of these techniques in a tool we call Graphinity. Suppose we query a large graph for paths connecting the nodes A, B, and C to nodes F and G. The query returns a graph that contains 11 paths connecting these nodes, but understanding these paths is challenging. For example, a question such as, which of the starting nodes have more connections to nodes F and G is difficult to answer with traditional graph visualization techniques. The connectivity matrix aids this type of analysis. In the connectivity matrix, we visualize properties of path sets connecting start and end nodes. The matrix rows represent the nodes where the path starts. The columns represent the end nodes. The properties of path sets between two nodes are displayed in the cell. Here, we show the count of paths between each pair of start and end nodes. This visualization provides an overview of connectivity between nodes while hiding information about middle nodes. The intermediate node table reveals information about the nodes in the middle of the path. It visualizes properties of path sets for the intermediate nodes while also taking the position of the node into account. Here, the node D appears in the middle of a two-hop path exactly once, and it appears thrice at the second position in three-hop paths. These two complementary views summarize connectivity as relationships between start and end nodes and display information about the intermediate nodes used in those paths. We demonstrate these two techniques in a prototype system called Graphinity. We present this system using a network of flights in the United States. This data set contains approximately 300 airports, the nodes, and 13,000 flights, which we treat as edges. The connectivity matrix and the intermediate node table are at the heart of the Graphinity system. In addition, Graphinity also provides an interface for visually defining path queries and supplemental views showing details of selected paths. Suppose we are interested in flights connecting the West Coast to New England. Here, we query for paths connecting the airports in California, Washington, and Oregon to airports in New England. We limit the path length to less than 2 hops. The connectivity matrix displays the connectivity between these airports. Since airport codes are not very readable, we can display other node attributes, such as the city and states of each airport. We can also show the node degree of an airport, which provides context about how busy the airports are. Since interpreting the matrix depends on the order of its rows and columns, we support dynamic ordering based on node attributes. We can also order based on matrix reordering algorithms. This ordering reveals that Los Angeles and San Francisco are the only airports that can reach the airport OHR in Massachusetts. The intermediate node table reveals information about the node's middle of path. Here, the link highlighting reveals information about which path passed through the airport of JFK. We can also see details about the paths passing through JFK using the couple.
Okay, I guess you get the idea, right? And so that's a very powerful tool for people who want to study this connectivity in some detail, and it was actually designed mostly for this connectomics use case.
Graphs model relation.
Okay, next I want to do, again, a little exercise. We'll be talking about trees. And what I want you to do here is to do some, like a multivariate tree visualization exercise. So I've kind of like written down here a data structure for, let's say, a folder, right? That could be the folder where I have all my lecture slides and my exams in for this class. And so that folder has a hierarchy, so it's a tree. And it has files in them, and the files have a size, right? And I would like you to think about 2 different visualizations to show this kind of data. We'll do like 10 minutes for this. Yeah, one for you.
Yeah,
Sure. Okay, so what are some of the ideas that you came up with? Yeah.
So we thought about the type of file and the size of the size of the node, the size of the.
Okay, so you would have something like your root here, and if the root is like a directory, would it be big or?
The root, the data that would be a total of all the sizes of the file.
Okay, so the root would be the biggest one here, and then I would have two directories going from it, something like this.
Yeah, and again, the size of the directories would again be like the size of the sum of the size of the file inside it.
Okay.
Then we expand according to the color will be according to the extent.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, other ideas?
One pretty similar to that, but like the root node would just be one big circle and file would be like circle 15.
Okay, yeah. That would be slightly tricky to make it proportional though, right? Because if I nest a circle in a circle, I have like all of this area here, but you know, it still works. But yeah, I've seen this a couple of times. Yeah.
I'll probably do the same thing with the first one, but you do not have the rest keep the sum of all the sizes together, just because maybe that could
Ye- Yeah, so you would do something like an abstract representation for a directory, but then have like a specific file, maybe scaled. Okay, yeah, cool. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, something like this. Okay. Something like this. Other ideas? This is cool. This is called an implicit layout. Like this is also an implicit layout, and these were explicit layouts. Yeah.
So, like, math, right, for rectangles, but instead of putting various, if I'm
As a log of the size?
longer, because, you know, well, usually different types.
Mhm.
Kilobytes.
Yeah.
So that might
Okay. Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Should you log transform a tree map or not? I think it depends on the task, right? If the task is to find the biggest files, maybe not. If the task is to have a good overview of all the files, maybe yes. Ideas? Yeah. Yeah, so I could have like essentially like the simple thing, right? Where I have here are my directories, and I would have some glyph here. And then one thing I could do is I could basically do a layout like this. And I could potentially even scale this here, like make this bars, right? And this could be the size of the file in here. So like there's lots of options. Go ahead. Yeah, that works. Then you basically, you can say, hey, how much of my share are the directories, how much of my share are files, and so on. Yeah. I'm sure all of these ideas, somebody has implemented them before. So yeah, we kind of got like a lot of different types of things here. And so as in for regular graphs, we have like the two types that are the node link diagrams, so and we have the matrices. And for trees, we have the node link diagrams and implicit layouts. And I'll start off with these node link diagrams, the explicit tree visualizations, right? So the one thing that is most familiar for everybody is this kind of visualization here, right? So these trees that we all know, you can kind of like this one here. There's some interactive versions on here, but this is called like a Rheingold-Tilford layout. So basically this layout just guarantees that all of the leaves have enough space to be shown here, right? So this is like a fairly simple thing. You just traverse the tree. You do something very much like what we did in homework 2, right? For that layout. And you can, of course, do this in a linear way, or you can do this in a radial way. And the advantage of the radial way is, of course, that you fit more of it on one screen, right? So here, this is the same network. You can see more of the structure here. The downside of the radial layout is obviously the labels are harder to read, right? So in practice, it depends a little bit. And then this one here, you can scroll easily. This one here, that doesn't really, like, if your network gets much bigger, it gets tricky. And one thing that the networks and hierarchical layouts generally are super good at is this dynamically rolling out subparts of the tree, right? So you can say, like, I could at any point here, I could collapse all of the children of that node and only show that node. And this is like a very, very old idea. Remember in the very first lecture, I showed you the video of the mother of all demos by Douglas Engelbart and other people in Berkeley. And they actually demonstrated this kind of like dynamic tree manipulation on a computer in 1968, right? So that's a very old idea and is a very powerful idea. And so, as I mentioned, you can have these interactive tree layouts where you can kind of like dynamically expand these elements if you want to. This is all implemented in D3. And then there's often a challenge is comparing two trees, right? And so there's tools out there like Tree Juxtaposer here that is designed for comparing two alternative trees of life, because trees of life are just reconstructions with some probabilistic structure, right? And so if you have two alternatives, you want to compare them. And so this is what this tool here is designed for. And I don't want to play the video right now in the interest of time, but if you're interested in that, definitely take a look. This is, by the way, I think the only Infobase paper ever published at SIGGRAPH. The most interesting tree layouts are these implicit tree layouts, where we've had a few of them, right? The circle packing here or the tree map. And so these implicit layouts, what they have in common is they don't show edges, right? They show the nodes and the relationships to their children by some implicit layout. And that's why they're called implicit layout, right? So they're like here, for example, we're showing this by containment. These two circles are children of that circle because they're contained. Here, we're showing them by adjacency, right? So this here is the parent of these two children because they're adjacent to each other. And so we have these three different techniques for implicit layouts: the tree map, the sunburst, and the icicle plot. And basically, the tree map is kind of like a little bit its own idea, and the sunburst and the icicle plot are more or less the same thing. The one time it's circular, the other time it's linear, right? So we'll be walking through those now. And so tree maps have been around for quite a bit. I think implicitly we've mentioned them a few times, but like to be very clear about how they work, right? So here we have a root node, the white node, and then we have four children: a blue, a green, and a yellow, and a red child. And so this is like, in this case here, we are not scaling by, we are just scaling each node at the second level has the same size, each node at the third level has the same size, and so on. So we're not adjusting for any attributes here. And so what we can see is that the leaves here, the green and the yellow one, are clearly shown, but the root node, the white one, is actually not shown at all, right? That's always like a thing about tree maps, that the intermediate nodes, the non-leaf nodes, they're not shown at all, right? So we only show the leaf nodes, and everything else is just implied by the structure. So we can reconstruct that there is a leaf node because there's this big frame around it, right? And similarly for the blue node has four children, and one of the four children has four children, and so we get this nested approach here. And again, this dark blue node here isn't explicitly shown, but we know it's there because there's this continuous rectangle, right? And so people have developed this originally. Like there are some versions of it that are much older, but like a Viz paper is from 1991 by Johnson and Schneiderman, and they came up with this layout for something like file structures, right? And this is kind of like the original tree map algorithm produced graphs like this. And so one thing that's not so great about this is that we have these kind of like elements of unequal proportions, right? So see that there are these like little slivers in here, and there's little slivers in here. And so we have these thin slices that are difficult to compare. And so people have created this algorithm that's called squarified tree maps. So I'll show you the result first. So here is kind of like the original tree map, and here's the squarified tree map, right? And the squarified tree map, the algorithm here tends to, or it tries to ensure that the proportion between the sides of the elements is as close to rectangular as possible, or as close to square as possible. And so how does the algorithm roughly work. This is by an algorithm by Burrus, Huizing, and Van Wyk. So you start out in step 1, you horizontally subdivide to optimize the aspect. So you add this element here, then you add another element, and you could add it here, but you don't do that because this would kind of like, the better aspect ratio would be to just put in those 2 elements. So you have like a better aspect ratio between the sides. Then you add this particular element here, and then you realize, okay, this isn't such a great idea because we have like not very good aspect ratios. Maybe it's like we backtrack and we try this alternative here, right? And so here we now have a good aspect ratio for 4, and then we keep doing this. We add 3 here. That actually improves the aspect ratio of 4, so this is a good choice. If we add 2 here, it kind of like is not a great. It actually deteriorates the aspect ratio, and so we're placing 2 here and so on, right? And so that's the principle of the algorithm. Exactly. It's trying to be a square, as close as possible to a square. That's why it's called squarified tree maps. And so that way you kind of avoid these little slices, right? And these little slices are really annoying because then you get overplotting with the edges and you can't show labels and so on. And I think these results are pretty impressive, right? Between those two, I think everybody would agree that this here is clearly the better layout, right? And so if you do then some kind of like nice rendering on top of it, to like here, this is like this kind of like lightning effect that you see these squares really pop out. You get these very deeply nested trees that are visible. And one thing that this here is the unframed version, so where the directories or the intermediate nodes aren't actually shown. You can, in theory, just give each intermediate node a bit of a frame. That's a possibility. And so then you kind of see implicitly. So for example, if you had 5 directories deep, but nothing in between, you would see that with the frames, right? But these would be not visible at all if you didn't have any of the frames. And you can actually use this on your computer. And I've used this whenever, like when I was in college, I was an IT guy for a local company, and I often had to, like back then, hard drive space was limited, and I used these tools to kind of really clean up the hard drives, right? And this here is, for example, Grand Perspective, which is a tool for Mac, but there's Sequoia View, which is a tool for Windows, and there are similar implementations in Linux, and so you can use this to clean up your own hard drive. And here I'm looking at my project repository, and what you can quickly see here is that just like these 4 projects here seem to be using the most of this directory, right? So there we can hover over them, and these are all video files from some projects back then. And these video files seem to really dominate. And so if I just delete 8 files in this subdirectory, I'm cleaning up half my hard drive space, right? So that's kind of like a useful task, and it doesn't matter. I can actually just click on this node here and say reveal in Finder, right? And it will show me where is that file. So it's kind of a useful thing to do. Okay. Any questions about tree maps? Okay, this is actually, this tool here, this Windows tool, is by these guys. They wrote the Windows tool when they developed the squarified tree map algorithm, and it's still, well, at least when I tried it a couple of years ago, it was still working, even 20 years later. Okay, so a sunburst is a slightly different idea. So here are 2 different versions of it. This one is on the left here is on D3. This here is like a fancy implementation we did a couple of years ago. But let's look at the simple one first. And so a sunburst has the root here in the center, and then all of the kind of nodes that are direct descendants of the root are adjacent to the root, kind of like they share a segment of the circle outside. So we can see that this here, the root here, this is like, again, the Flare project. Then we have like one big subfolder that is this, then we have another subfolder that is util, then we have another subfolder that is animate, and so on. And we see that there's no leaves at the second level, right? These are all directories. And then these directories, again, have subdirectories, and this subdirectory again has other subdirectories. And in these subdirectories, we finally have some leaves, right? And so the big difference here is that we immediately see what are the big subtrees, right? That's something that isn't quite as clear in the in the tree map, and we immediately also see the structure of the tree, right? The structure here, every intermediate node is also shown. Like this stuff is only visible maybe through the frames if you choose a frame layout in the tree maps, but typically is not shown at all, right? And so if you want to understand both topology and the attributes, this is actually a very good representation, right? And so here you can actually zoom in on different elements. So you can say, hey, I want to make this my new root. And then that transforms in, and this becomes your new root, right? And now you can focus on that particular element. And I can do the same thing here for this directory. And if I click here in the middle, I can zoom back out. And so that's a very cool layout technique. This is originally developed by John Stasko, who is like a Viz professor at Georgia Tech. And back when I did my PhD, we implemented this version here that has like an even fancier zoom thing, right? So you could click on any segment and the rest of the whole thing, and it would kind of like duplicate in the middle. It would show you the segment that you're looking at. It would dynamically pop out and grow around it, right? So that was still done in OpenGL, the good old days, basically. And then here is kind of like the same idea, but maybe even a little bit simpler, definitely simpler to implement, right? Because now instead of having like a root in the middle of I guess a circle and everything else radiating out, you have just a root here at the top. And then you have the subdirectories shown explicitly here, right? And so the size of a file here corresponds to its width here on the side. And so, like, yeah, simpler. Like, what do you think are the advantages from the Icicle plot compared to, let's say, the tree map or to the sunburst? Like, one thing we see is that the root in the Icicle plot kind of like takes up a fifth of the space, right? And the root isn't all that interesting. So giving it so much space maybe isn't the best approach. So that's kind of like nicer about the radial layouts, the sunburst. But which one would you like to use, for example, if you want to clean up your hard drive? The sunburst, the radial, or the tree map? Yeah, that's kind of like, you know, it really focuses on the leaves and on the attributes. So that's for cleaning up your hard drive. That's probably a good choice. But you wouldn't necessarily so easily know, like, what are my big directories, right? That would be harder. Like, you can still tell, but it gets a bit tricky. Okay, so these are the different choices that you have for implicit tree layouts. So kind of like, just to recap some pros and cons generally, you have the pro is that they tend to be space efficient, especially the tree map, because we don't need to explicitly draw edges. It scales very well up to large graphs. You can actually, in a tree map, you can probably show like 1 million nodes, right? Especially also since you can, like, you know, there's some natural aggregation happening. It's well suited for attribute-based tasks on the node set. So if you have nodes of different types, you can color code them. If you have nodes of different sizes, you can scale them. Depending on the spatial encoding, they can also be useful for topology-based tasks. So if you have like an Icicle or a sunburst plot, they are useful for topology-based tasks, not so much in the tree map itself. The con is, of course, you can't use them for general graphs. You can only use them for trees. And since the node positions are used to represent edges, you can't do anything with the edges, right? So if you have weighted edges, these techniques are not suitable at all. You can't show them. The node positions are also used to represent edges. So that means you can no longer freely arrange the nodes. So you can't really do like a good tree map or a sunburst and try to still encode geography, right? Obviously, which you can do with other networks. Okay, if you're interested in tree visualization, there's this tool here, treevis.net, that you can go to, and you can look for any kind of tree visualization that was ever published. There's currently 333 tree visualization techniques listed here. And I'm going to look for some weird stuff here. Like, I'm going to look for 3D trees that are also implicit. And then I'd have something like this, right? The strata tree map. Which one? This one? This here is basically stacked polytopes. I guess if you did it in 2D, you can have a Voronoi tree map, right? That is kind of like something that is commonly done, and that would be kind of like the Voronoi tree map of in 3D here. I'm not particularly sure that this is all that useful, but if we look at 2D implicit, there are some interesting ones here. Let's see where this is like a Voronoi tree map. So that kind of looks like cauliflower, right? But that's kind of like also an interesting idea because it's like a good, so let's say interesting aesthetics and also probably fairly reasonable. Okay, and then if you want to like visualize networks, you can of course do this with D3, and of course you can implement everything yourself. But there are some tools out there that that are good for network visualization off the shelf. One of them is Gephi. It's like an open source tool that is focused on node link layouts. So you can definitely try that. The other one is Cytoscape. Cytoscape is kind of like the biggest player probably. It's designed mostly for bio applications, right? So people have done this for all kinds of protein interaction networks and so on. They have a very rich plugin infrastructure, and they also have a web version, Cytoscape Web or Cytoscape JS. Both of them exist now, where you can like don't have to download the software package, but can play with this on the web. And Cytoscape JS is kind of like a layout technique. If you want to render some networks on your own website, you can use Cytoscape JS for that. And then if you want to work in Python, you can use NetworkX. NetworkX is a better graph analytics library than it is a graph visualization library, but it can also do some graph visualization, but it's not the best visualization library out there. And then we've been working on this project here, the MultiNet project, which is this multivariate network visualization tool. So I can quickly show this. And this is kind of like, you can come upload your own data set and then build your own graph data set. And then you can create different visualizations without having to code at all. So here we're starting out with like a network that is the Les Miserables network, but then we can, for example, color code the groups here. And we could also kind of lay out these different elements in different ways and so on. So this is for something for like that everybody can play with, and where you can kind of like create these network visualizations on the web without having to code. Okay, so then I want to switch gears, not too much, but a little bit, to talk about multivariate networks. And here we would have like an example of a social network, but they're also about the attributes about those people. So if we have this person here, Adam, we would have his age, he would be 20 years old, he would be a PhD student with a certain GPA and 3,000 Twitter followers, right? And the multivariate network has both the topology and the node and the edge attributes. So we would have these attributes for every single person in that network, and we want to jointly analyze these attributes and the network at the same time. And as you can imagine, there's this trade-off that we have to kind of like work with between topology and attributes. And so choosing efficient encoding for one aspect interferes with the ability to effectively visualize the other. And so we wrote this tutorial here is based on the state-of-the-art report, which is like a very long paper analyzing all kinds of different layouts and all kinds of different approaches you can have for multivariate networks. And so I'll loosely structure this presentation based on this report. And so this is kind of like the main figure here. So we have the layouts here on top. And there's 3 different types of layouts which are familiar to us. And then we have view operations, and then data operations and layout operations. And so we'll dig into this. And generally, as always, when we talk about visualization, there are tasks, there is usage, there's tools and applications, and there's layouts and others. And so we'll start off with tasks because, like as we did for tables and for networks, tasks really are super important. So the first question we have to ask us is like, how is an MVN task different from a regular graph task? The MVN tasks rely on both the topology of the network and the attributes of the nodes and the edges. So for example, here we would have like a particular person in a network, and we would care like a topology-based style, or like a task here would be how many of this person's, Carolina's collaborators would be from the oceanography field as opposed from the computer science field, right? And so we could kind of like show like these attributes of the people. And so we would look at both, how is she connected to the two various people, and are they of a certain type? And that would be then kind of like a combined topology and attribute-based task. Or we could look at the connectivity strength, right? So who are the people that she frequently interacted with, or somebody else, like, or which cluster of authors has the highest number of combined collaborations, right? And so here we would look at both the topology and the strength of the ties between these different nodes. And this could be anything, right? This could be cities, or this could be like any other thing. It could be like attributes like what is the speed limit on a particular road, and so on. Or it could be business hours, and anything like that can be like, what is an efficient way I can complete my errands, would be a question that I could ask if I have like speed limits and business hours on a road network, for example. And so this is just to say that these multivariate network tasks are fairly important. And so what we have here, the blue parts are the topology-based aspects, and the orange parts here are the attribute-based aspects. And so we have these tasks that rely on both of them. And so these MVN-V tasks are applied to topological structures that we kind of like, identified. So first we have, sometimes you want to learn something about a single node or an edge. Sometimes you want to learn something about neighbors. Sometimes you want to learn something about path, or about clusters, or about like a whole network or subnetwork. So if you could summarize like, what's the average age of all the people in this network, or what's the average age in this particular cluster, for example. And so let's review some of these network and attribute characteristics, because they are very important in the choices that you can make about networks, about your visualization. So the first one here is topology. And topology really you essentially can have very different structures in topology based on the density and so on. And then we also have these attributes, of course, again, about the network. Okay, this is a little detailed. So generally, your choice of visualization technique really depends on the network size. Do you have a small network, a medium network, or a large network, right? If you have a very large network, it gets really tricky to use things like an adjacency matrix, for example. And if you need like a lot of space for your attributes, you also have to worry quite a lot about it. And then the other type of network is kind of important as well. So if you have a sparse network, you might, for example, use a node link layout, versus if you have a dense network, you might want to use something like an adjacency matrix. If you have a layered network, you might use some different structures. So here you could imagine you have layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, and layer 4, right? And you might want to show that. Or if you have a tree, which would be, again, a different structure. And so we came up with this taxonomy of layouts and operations. And let's jump into these layouts first. Okay. So for layouts, we have, as I mentioned, we have these node link diagrams, but then I can also use small multiples again to visualize attributes about them. If you want to just show attributes about the network in a separate table, you would have like these view operations. So this would be kind of like, remember the lecture we had about multiple views? I could just have my network visualization, my regular network visualization on the left, and my attribute visualization on the right, and they could just be connected by linking and brushing. And data operations would allow us to do things like filtering or aggregating or creating supernodes and so on. Okay, so let's, I'll be using this example network here. So we have a group of people that have these different types of relationships. They're like parents, or they're dating, or they're the coach of somebody, or they're married. And then just for like fun, we also have some kind of like favorite beverage for each person, and how many of them they're drinking on these days 1, 2, and 3. So we'll use this example network here. And you can see that Cole here likes port. He had 1 single glass of port on day 1 and 4 glasses of port on day 3, whereas Mark here has had kind of like a bit of a beer drinking week. And then we have relationship attributes. So for example, these 2 guys have been friends for 3 years. The first 2 are co-workers for 3 years. The second 2 is the soccer coach of the child for 2 years, and so on. So we have all of these different attributes that play a role here. And so we have these 3 different fundamental layouts, and all of these are node link layouts that we can use. The first one here is embedding directly the elements in the nodes and in the links, and then we'll have some like more fancy layouts. So let's start out with these topology-driven layouts on the left, where we use on-node and on-edge encoding, versus these attribute-driven layouts on the right, where we kind of like position our nodes by attributes. Okay, so this is kind of the basic thing that we all are probably most intuitively familiar with. We would like lay this out. We would label the person, or we would label the connectivity. But we could also kind of do some kind of like encoding where, for example, we could say that a node is encoded by color, and color here represents a categorical attribute, and the size represents a quantitative attribute, right? That's like a reasonable choice to do, but what if I have more attributes than 2, right? So I could do something like show little glyphs in top of this net. Here I have 2 bar charts and 1 categorical encoding, right? So you could play with this if you wanted to, and you could create a layout like this. And if we combine all of this into one big network, we we get something like this. And people have done develop these embedded glyphs on top of networks in many different works. So here is just like an overview of 6 different papers that this server here looked for and analyzed. This one you've seen before. This is like the paper that was about looking at how people move between states. And so we had people within Washington, right, moving within Washington, and then people moving from New York to Washington. But here, there is actually very fancy on-node encoding going on. These are actually little embedded visualization on each of those nodes. And then finally, this here is actually very unique encoding. This is about like sequence alignment by Sidney Nielsen and some of her colleagues. And this is about Aptom. Well, what the purpose isn't that important, but in the end, what this is showing is edges of very different lengths, right? And that is kind of tricky to show, because as we know, if we have edges of different lengths, we get these weird layouts. And so what she did is, instead of showing these like straight links, is that she made those links squiggle. And if the squiggle is very intense, of course, the link gets longer, right? And so you can actually show very long sequences for these edges here with these squiggles. And you can see that this here is a long edge versus this is a very short edge. And you mostly judge this by the frequency of the squiggle, right? Or here we have like an extremely dense one here on the right, and then here is like a very loose one. So this would be an example of applying this to an edge. And then people have done bar charts on edges, right? That's also a possibility. I guess it works to some degree, but of course it makes your network pretty cluttered. So on-node and on-edge encoding is the benefits of it is that it's easily understood by most users, and it works well for all types of networks. But the drawback is scalability. The node size leaves little space to encode attributes, and it can get confusing if you have lots of attributes. So generally, we recommend these node link layouts with embedded on-node or on-edge encodings for small networks when only a few attributes in the nodes are shown, or in combination with a zooming or filtering strategy. Okay, so one very interesting approach is this attribute-driven faceting. And so sometimes you have some categories in a network, right? And so let's suppose we have these 3 drinks, Coke, beer, and port. And we essentially reserve a special drawing region for these three. And what we can do now is we can lay out our network such that the people that are in that category are simply in that region, right? And so this is kind of like, if we think back to our visual vocabulary, we had this, even for categories, positional encoding is the best encoding, right? So if you want to emphasize the categories those people are in, you could choose a layout like this, right? And so you could have the Coke drinkers on the top, the beer drinkers in the middle, and the port drinkers at the bottom. And you can still show the network on how they are connected. And you can still create your layout within these areas. You could still freely arrange that layout. So that really doesn't matter what happens within them as long as they're associated with the region. And this has been done, for example, in this paper here, Semantic Substrates, which is about how different courts, well, the data set here was different courts. You have a circuit court in green and the Supreme Court in red, and how different decisions from these courts reference other decisions from the other courts, right? So in this case, they're looking only at those two decisions here, which are the Supreme Court references that they're, the Supreme Court's decisions that they're referencing. And you can see the network here. And the other thing that's interesting about this here is that this is a network visualization, and it is this faceted based on Supreme or Circuit Court, but then it's also actually laid out by time, right? So these nodes are placed here by time. Only the Y position here is not data driven. And this is also useful in many applications in biology. So for example, this picture here shows a tool that's called Cerebral. That's like actually a Cytoscape plugin. Remember this tool that I mentioned that people use in biology? And when you do these kind of like, for example, what's going on in a cell, if you do these diagrams or network visualizations, you have these different cell compartments. So you have extracellular space, you have space in the cytoplasm, you have space directly on the membrane of the cell, you have elements that are directly in the nucleus, and so on. And so you could have all of these different regions, and it's really, really important to understand which compartment of a cell something is happening in and to understand the biology. And so you often see these layouts that explicitly consider these compartments as categories and create it like this. And so this is exactly what's going on here. So you have these like one node in the extracellular space, then one node here on the membrane. This here is in the cytoplasm, this here is in the nucleus, and this here is just a group of transcriptionally regulated genes. So they might not be in any particular compartment. And that's also a very powerful thing to do. So generally, this attribute-driven faceting is well suited for networks with different node types or with an important category or set-like attribute. But it's kind of like not super scalable with respect to the number of nodes and network density compared to node link layouts. And neighborhoods, path, and clusters are not easily visible if they span different facets, right? So we do recommend this for networks where nodes can be separated into groups easily, and where these groups are really central to the analysis. So the kind of like taking this to the extreme is attribute-driven positioning, where essentially what you do is you plot the nodes based on an X and the Y attributes, and you only create this the topology on top. So this is kind of like more the fixed layouts that we talked about. The fixed layouts we talked about in the context of geography a lot, but of course this could be also data, right? So here is an example. This is GraphDice, and this essentially shows a network layout on top of a scatter plot, right? And so here we have an X and the Y position, and these nodes are just laid out by that position, and then we show the links on top of it, right? And so that really, the question here is mostly what are the attributes, how do they cluster, and then secondary is what is the connectivity in the network. You can also do this in 1D, right? So here is an example that we'll actually be looking at in a design critique in the future. This is edge mapped by Marian Dirk and his colleagues. And so what you see here is the X layout here is time, and then you have the connectivity between them in these arcs. And because it's a 1D layout, we can do these arcs very nicely, and we don't have any problems with clutter, right? Because N is also only for one selected node, right? That's always tricky with 1D layouts like this. If I wanted to show all connections, it would get very cluttered. But if I only show connections for a selected element, I get these very nice layouts here. Okay, so attribute-driven positioning is great for quantitative analysis of the attributes, but it's not really good for looking at topology of the networks. But you could conceivably have a tool, right, where you can choose, okay, let's lay out first by like some force-directed layout, and then if I'm done analyzing my topology, I could move to this attribute-driven positioning layout, and it's actually one of the things that the MultiNet tool can do for you. So this is recommended for smaller, sparse networks where relationships between nodes, attributes are paramount to the analysis task, and topological features only provide context. Okay, so for tabular layouts, we have talked about the adjacency matrices already, but there's two other types of tabular layouts that we haven't talked about. And we haven't talked about adjacency matrix in the context of attributes, right? A little bit we talked about edge attributes, but let's look at them in more detail. So the way the adjacency matrices work, as I just said earlier, is we have the same nodes in the rows and in the columns, and then we fill in the cells here with the edge information. And so we kind of like construct this one by one in this example here, but then we have our network here. Okay, so now, as I mentioned before, I can encode how long have these people been in this kind of relationship by color coding, and that's really what adjacency matrices are great for. But it's also cool that I have kind of like this tabular layout, because now I can actually use a tabular visualization or just a table next to it to encode those attributes, right? So I can like put in a label very nicely. I can put in a categorical attribute very nicely, and I can put in a numerical attribute very nicely. And I can like, adjust the ordering as I have to do for a matrix, and it still retains the tabular structure is still there. And so people have tried all kinds, like one thing that is obvious, right? At least one categorical or one numerical attribute is easy to do, but if you want to have multiple attributes, it gets tricky. And this paper here really tried to think about what are some different visualization techniques that we could use for multiple edge attributes. And so they played here with little nested bar charts, or with colored segments, or with these nested rectangle elements, or with these nested circles here. And the case study here was, again, some brain connectomics one that they looked at. And this is also kind of like what we're doing in the video that I showed earlier about Graphinity, in this case for a connectivity matrix. And also notice that we have like all of these attributes shown here in the rows and in the columns. And this is like taking this to the extreme. So we have here, this is like the structure of a table. Then here, the structure of the table. So this is like a regular matrix. Then here we have an attribute similarity kind of like visualization. And then here we have attributes about these elements, right? So here we're looking at both the topology about a similarity metric in terms of how are these nodes related to each other based on their attributes, and what are the actual attributes. And so you can really combine, in this matrix layout, you can combine topological and attribute analysis very nicely. And here's like one thing that I did with a student a couple of years ago, where we're looking at these, this is again a flight network, and we have a hierarchy even here. Is it in south or east, south central, west, south central, population of these areas, income, poverty, and so on. And then we have kind of like the same information here about the structure, at least the region wise at the top. And so we have different levels of granularity that are all rolled up. So this here would be like the whole south, for example. And so we're using different colors in this case to indicate that these are different scales. So adjacency matrix with tables are ideal for dense and completely connected networks, but they require quadratic space, as we mentioned already, and it's kind of like hard to choose the right reordering algorithm in practice. This is recommended for smaller, complex, and dense networks with rich nodes and or edge attributes for all tasks, of course, except for those involving paths. Okay, so quilts is kind of like a fairly crazy idea. Quilts are like they originally came from genealogies, but the idea of quilts is that we start out here with our network, and then we layer them, right? So we have layer, the first layer, the second layer, the third layer here, fourth layer, the fifth layer. And these, note that there are only connections between the layers. There's no connection like jumping from Sue to Abby. And if you have a network like that, a quilt is actually good. If you have a network that isn't layered, then you can't use a quilt, at least not the default quilt, or not without not showing some edges. But if you have that, you can kind of like, well, let's skip over the skip links here, because that is kind of like the more complicated piece. But if you have that, you can create this quilt layout. So we have our 5 layers, and then we start off by moving layer 1 here, and then layer 2 here. And then we're saying that those 2 here are connected by kind of like that intersection here. And then these here are friends. This is shown by that intersection here. And these guys here are dating because of that intersection here, and so on. So we can, like, this person here is dating this person and a coworker with this person, right? And so that's kind of like the idea behind quilts. And as you can see, because it's this layered network, genealogies is usually generations of people, right? And so that kind of like lends itself nicely to visualize genealogies. And so this here would be an example where we have a skip link. And so this is, yeah, I'll skip over this and over this, maybe. And just to demonstrate here, well, how this is used for genealogies. And here we have like a genealogy of the Simpsons. And we can see that we have Marge and Homer. Marge and Homer have together children that are Bart and Maggie and Lisa, right? But Marge is also the sister of Selma and Patty. And so they're the children of Jacqueline and Clancy. And so that's like how you can read a genealogy like this. And people have used this for, you know, like visualizing very large genealogies. And it's kind of useful to do that way, because it's a better layout than if you had a tree. So yeah, you can use these quilts for layered networks, but you can't really show any links between non-consecutive layers. So they can be problematic to integrate. They can be integrated, but usually it looks pretty bad. And we do recommend these for layered or k-partite networks with no or limited skip links, so links that jump. And then the most bizarre of all network layouts is actually BioFabric, probably. And BioFabric is kind of like this idea that you have people and you show their connectivity as a link along, like you have a person here is a row, and a connectivity is a link connecting these 2 rows, right? So that means those 2 people here are connected. And we can kind of like do this for, like, this person here is connected to this person here is connected to this person, right? So they have a little bit of a relationship with adjacency matrices, but they are not the same, right? Because there's no columns, right? The columns are the links here. And that's kind of like interesting. And so it's really interesting because we can now visualize the attributes like we could in the matrix about the people in a table here on the side, but we can also visualize the attributes about the edges in a table at the bottom, right? And so if we have very complex attributes about our edges and about our nodes, that could be kind of like a useful visualization technique. Of course, you have some of the same problems as you have for matrices, right? You have to really like try to optimally order both the order of edges and also the order of people, and so that is important to do. Let's see, and here is like an example of the Les Miserables network in a BioFabric layout. So you see Valjean here as being like this very connected person, and then he's connected to Gavroche, and Gavroche is connected to all of these other people, right? So it takes a little bit of training to read those, but they can be useful, and I think they can actually be most useful if you have both node and edge attributes. So they can be used to visualize rich edge attributes and node attributes at the same time, but they're difficult to discover neighbors and clusters in BioFabrics compared to, for example, matrices. And this really only works for small and sparse networks with many nodes and really rich edge attributes. Okay, so then the very, like a few little things. juxtapose, like view operations, that is just something that we talked a little bit about already. The juxtaposed one is the thing that's kind of like most familiar, right? Where we have two separate visualizations, one for the attributes, one for the topology. That could be like the node attributes, or it could also be the edge attributes. So if we have a network like this, we could just put next to it a table, right? That's a simple thing. And then if we select one person, we can show this person in the table. And that's kind of like trivially to implement and therefore very useful. And here would be like the same thing with an edge table, right? And people have, of course, used this before. So they've used this for, in this example here, this is kind of like exploring literature data sets. So here we have some kind of like authors and papers, and then how these papers are spaced out in like based on topics. Or this here is kind of like the graph dice example that I showed before, with the layout that we have here, the spatial layout, but then it also has a table next to it, right, that is connected to it. So we see this very commonly to show additional attributes, even if you use already an attribute visualization for a network. And so the great thing about this is that we have these independent views, which we can optimize either for topology or for attributes independently. But it's not great for tasks that are taking account of both the topology and also the attributes of these nodes or edges. So this is something that works for large networks and for very large numbers of heterogeneous types of nodes and link attributes. So that's kind of like the big advantages of this is scale, right? Because I can optimize independently. And integrated is maybe the last one that I want to talk about today, but that's kind of like a neat idea. So the idea of integrated layouts is that I can maybe take a layout like the table here on the right and adjust my node link layout such that it fits into the table, right? So here we now have the connectivity shown with these links, and that works sometimes, right? It's a little tricky. We've done this. I showed this video last time. We've done this for, like, here we kind of calculate spanning trees of the networks, and we show additional attributes about these, or we kind of lose some of the edge information that can later be brought in. And here is kind of like an interesting idea for like simple metabolic networks like this here. You would have a network like this that has some like branching, and then down here a cycle, right? These authors have developed kind of like a convention of how to unroll all of this into one linear path. And like they splice in the branch here, for example, they have these links here. And then here they have a special symbol for a cycle. So that symbol here means that this here is a cycle. This here are the branches, right? And the branch here continues from here to here and from here to here. And then they can actually show attributes like this. These are attributes about the nodes, and then here we have attributes about the edges. And so they kind of like came up with a smart way of creating a linear layout from that network in that particular paper. And therefore, they can show these attributes about the network here very effectively. Of course, the problem here is that it can get, well, pretty busy. Here is like, you see these circular layouts frequently also in genomics, right? And these essentially show network structure, but they also have these attributes. And so our linear structure here is actually wrapped around the circle, but it's the same principle, right? And a pro here is that this is good at integrating attributes with the topology if the topology can be represented in a linear layout. A con is that it doesn't really work for complicated networks that can be sensibly linearized. And so this works for networks with several heterogeneous node attributes and are well suited for tasks on single nodes, neighbors, and path. And I guess at the end here, just wanted to briefly mention this website. So if you're interested in this, here's kind of like a summary of all of this, and you can actually, you have a little wizard here. So if you kind of can specify, my network is small in size, it's very dense, and it has several attributes. And now this guide or this tool here gives you a recommendation of which of these visualization techniques you should use based on these properties, right? And so you can see that for a small network with very dense nodes and many node attributes, the adjacency matrix would be your best choice here. That's on our group website. I can post a link later. And that's it for today. On Thursday, I will be traveling, but Kieran will be teaching about storytelling. And also remember, if you haven't already, you have to meet with your TA this week in your group. So if you haven't yet made an appointment, just make sure to reach out to them. Thanks, everybody.